Darren, and I'll be your host for the next hour. We've got a lot of great people in this webinar, and I'm just going to read a few off the list. So we're in great company. Morrison's, Musgrave, IKEA, One Stop, Co-op, Sainsbury's, Wanzl, Tesco, Amazon. Some really great brands there. So thank you very much for coming along. This is the first in a series of webinars between Wanzl and MBM, where we're highlighting issues in UK retailing. And we've got some other webinars coming up at the end.
On the drink again. And that's what you call a stash of tinnies. There you go.
Okay. Someone, if you think you're on mute, you're not. Would you mind going on mute for me? All right. So this is the first in a series of webinars. And at the end of this webinar, we'll highlight a couple of others that are coming up, which highlight issues in the industry. And who knows, next time, maybe you'll be one of the speakers, and we'd love to hear from you. If you wouldn't mind putting questions in the chat as we go, and then as we finish with a speaker, we'll either ask him a question or we'll wait until our Q&A at the end. All right. So that was the answer to that question. If anyone was reading that slide whilst we were waiting, it is a lot of money. This is our running order for the webinar. Firstly, we've got Russell, who works for Nielsen IQ. He's going to talk about trends with HFSS. Then we've got Andrew Grant. Andrew's one of our consultants here at MBM and with a huge experience at Tesco. Andy Palmer is a specialist in category management. He's going to share his thoughts on how HFSS affects category management. And then we've got Marc Radforth. Marc is Sales and Marketing Director at Wanzl, and he's going to share some of the implications both in the UK and around the world. Each of these presenters will get about 10 minutes to share their thoughts, and then we'll either do questions in between speakers or we'll wait till the end for the Q&A. Again, please put your questions in the chat and I'll try and moderate and get them all answered before we finish. Someone's just put one in the chat, so let me answer that straight off the bat. Will you be sending out the presentation after the meeting? Absolutely, yes, we will, of course. And we'll send you a recording as well. All right. So without further ado, I'm going to go top left on my screen over to the man with the beard, which is Russell. Russell, you're very welcome to come along and speak. We love having you. And I'll hand over to you and your first slide.
Brilliant. Thank you, Darren, and thank you very much for the invitation. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. So I just want to give you a quick overview of how Nielsen IQ sees HFSS playing out. So currently, HFSS categories are currently worth 25 billion in the UK marketplace. And what we're projecting is that potentially sales in these categories could fall by 10% or even more, depending on the strategies that manufacturers and retailers take to mitigate against these. So there's no surprise that manufacturers and retailers will look to try and recoup these losses or make these up in other areas. And the range of strategies they could use is radical ways in which they communicate to their shoppers in store and out of store, how they distribute, how they price, and also how they promote. And I think personally, most of all, is how they innovate going forwards. Just to give you an idea of the size of the scale, currently 40% of current off-shelf space is occupied by HFSS products. Next slide, please, Darren. So if I just draw your attention to the black box at the moment. So what this shows is the average uplift for when we have promotions. So when there's a discount with feature, you roughly see 112% increase. And when there's a 25% discount feature and display, which is a gondola end, you generally see 191% increase. So if we just take total chocolate confectionery as an example at the moment, so currently unaffected sales would be 2.3 billion. And then off-shelf promotions currently account for 0.6 billion pounds. So it gives us a total of just over 3 billion. So the worst case scenario for total chocolate is if total chocolate category loses all of those off-shelf and multi-buys, they're looking at a decline of 673 million, which is which is 22% decline. What we see, the likely case is that a lot of these losses from feature display will be moved to the aisle, because you can still promote within the aisle on the price. So what we're seeing is the likely outcome is going to be between 9 and 10%. With this data, what we've used is, obviously we have caveats that we've used the 2019 data purely because it's less impacted by COVID. Next slide, please, Dan. So what can manufacturers do to mitigate the effects of this? So promote non-HFS products. It's easier for some manufacturers than others, depending on their promotional mix. They can look to reformulate. So we saw a lot of reformulation when the sugar tax came out, and we see the same kind of thing happening as well. It's easier for some categories to reformulate than others. We've seen it in breakfast cereals already. Chocolate have tried it with limited success. Also looking to create non-HFSS, I wish they'd make it easier to say, non-HFSS MPD. And they'd also look to replace off-shelf promotions with increased on-shelf promotions. They'd also look to try and achieve a fair share of distribution and promotions. They could look to do a new main aisle fixture strategy. So what that means is they can have a fixed aisle which is seasonal. So you see that they sometimes call it the power aisle as you walk in, and you can use that for Easter eggs, for example. Improved signposting to HFS aisles. That could also mean changing store layouts, for example. So you have to walk through HFSS as an example. Use price rather than promotion, so potentially using everyday low pricing instead of promotional mechanics. Again, they can reduce the size, premiumize. So we've seen that again in soft drinks, that you can buy a 10 pack of Coke Zero for the same price as an 8 pack of full fat Coke. Find new ways of distribution channels. So in my opinion, the only way you can grow your product is by sell more to existing shoppers or sell ones to new shoppers. So I think one of the ways is to try and find an avenue to new shoppers. Also, another way is to persuade retailers to increase their shelf space for the category. And also, I think there's a lot of opportunities for retailers to expand and look at non-FSS manufacturers to fill the gap. Next slide, please, Darren. So what is actually being banned? So the promotion of HFS products will be restricted by location and volume prices as follows. So location restrictions, so you can't have products at the store entrance, aisle ends and checkouts. And also it affects their online equivalents, such as landing pages, banners, shopping basket and payment page promotions. There'll be volume restrictions, so multi-buys will be gone. And I've just got the sources there for where this information is from. And just to clarify in Nielsen speak, what we're seeing is that feature and display only and multi-buy will be reduced significantly. However, feature only, which is on-shelf promotion with a communicated benefit, will continue and probably increase as a result.
Okay, all right. Thanks very much, Russ. Okay, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'll wait for a few moments to see if we've got any particular questions for Russ, or you can hold them and we'll take them in the Q&A at the end. Russ, would you just give us one takeaway particularly from the last 3-4 slides that you shared?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a bit of an arms race between manufacturers to get their products reformulated and repackaged so they can get to the retailer first to make sure that they're listed, is how I see it. And also, I think innovation for non-HFSS products are going to be key. Yeah,
very true, very true. And they also need to make it easier to say.
Yes, they do.
Okay, I've also noticed on LinkedIn that there are some companies saying non-HFSS, which started to become a phrase that people are using in their roles and for their companies. I hadn't noticed that before. Okay, thanks very much, Russ.
No problem.
All right, let's move on. Andrew Grant, you used to work for Tesco for a very long time. You were buying director of Tesco many years ago. You worked with MBM as a consultant and as a trainer. Very welcome. Please share your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Darren, and good morning, everyone. Great to be in such illustrious company. I'm just going to be spending a few minutes just giving you, I guess, the nuts and bolts background of the proposed legislation. I'm pretty sure most of you, having looked at the attendees list, are probably pretty au fait with this, but there's probably is worth just going back to the brass tacks of exactly what the government are planning, because it's a pretty big change. It's the biggest single change in enforced dietary change since rationing in the Second World War. And the reason being, this goes back to 2007 when the government's childhood obesity strategy kicked off. You'll all remember, I'm sure, the initial advertising bans on TV during children's TV hours. You then had Jamie Oliver and the turkey twizzlers and the school meals. This is the culmination 13-14 years later of all those government efforts to basically try and stem off a population time bomb. The figures you can see there on the screen are quite scary. I mean, you know, I'm sure many of us here have got children, but you know, a quarter of children aged 4 or 5, so primary school kids, classed as obese, and then that rises to over a third of kids before they go to secondary school classed as obese. Quite scary, you know, 20, 30 years down the line, as they get to middle age, you know, what sort of problems are we storing up for the future? And I think Russ mentioned it previously. The government has seen that basically supermarket promotions, particularly volume promotions, multi-buys, etc., do drive consumption in this category. It's not called impulse. Internally, we tend to call most of the products covered by HFSS impulse products. And so no surprise, you give them feature, you give them promotion, and you get some mega uplifts. 191% was mentioned, which certainly I would be very, very used to. Okay, next slide, please, Darren. Yeah, so the legislation is due this autumn. So when Parliament comes back after the summer break, it is expected that the legislation will be put before Parliament this autumn. It was initially going to hit in April next year, as a result of some quite vociferous industry lobbying in terms of the sheer scale of this change and the implications. It's now been agreed that it will be put back to October 2022. And I'd be willing to bet 50p of Darren's money that there may be an even longer delay than that, because I think once it does go to Parliament, a lot of the worms are going to come out of the woodwork in terms of just how sea changing this could potentially be as it's currently proposed. Next slide, please, Darren.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, and to my last point, I think you read that list of 13 categories and you see just how broad and wide-ranging these changes are going to be. So 13 categories targeted. It's based on the Department of Health's nutrient profiling model. So when the children's advertising ban was brought in 2004, 2007, the Department of Health came up with a nutrient profiling model which determines whether a product is high in fat, sugar or salt. So any manufacturers listening who are maybe not sure whether their products are covered or not, is firstly they have to be in one of those categories, and then secondly they have to not get enough nutrient profiling points to class as non-HFSS. But you can see from some of those categories just how wide-ranging they are, and again, the devil will be in the detail. Everybody, I'm sure, remembers, you know, VAT on food, and was a Jaffa cake a biscuit or a cake? That rolled on for a long, long time. I am sure within this, particularly for me, the very last category, ready for cooking or reheating products. And goodness knows what can be in there. I assume that means all ready meals. But, you know, part prepared meat products with a sauce. You know, does that mean then that, joints of lamb with a mint dressing, ready to pour over mint dressing, are covered. There will be a lot of devil in the detail and potentially a lot of products covered that maybe we didn't expect. So as I said, that's why I'm willing to bet 50p of Darren's money that there may be further delays to this. Final slide for me, I think, Darren. Yeah, so what's in scope and what is not in scope? And again, there's some potential gaps in this and wriggle room in terms of how businesses may seek to minimise their potential losses as a result of this legislation. So basically, all businesses 50 employees plus that sells pre-packed food to the public are covered. Also, if they have greater than 2,000 square foot selling area, but also includes symbol and franchise retailers. So I was reading this morning one of the, I think, Independent Convenience News or one of those publications, and lots of small symbol convenience retailers, so family businesses that just happen to be part of a symbol group, are covered, even though they've only got one 2,000 square foot store and it's mum and dad running it. They're going to have to, as it's written, follow this legislation. All food retailers and all online food retailers are covered, and also retailers that sell, confectionery at their checkouts. You often see that in DIY sheds, garden centres, etc. What's not covered? Out of home, so immediate consumption foods, so takeaways, sandwich shops, coffee shops, and fast food outlets, and also all non-pre-packed foods are not covered. So for me, that says in-store bakery and deli is not covered, which is interesting given that most of the supermarkets have spent the last 3 years taking out deli counters. I know it's a big part of Wanzl's business. Does that mean the deli counter will come back selling HFSS products? Is that an opportunity? The other thing Darren and I have been speaking about the last few weeks on our weekly blog is these rapid grocers. These grocers that promise to deliver you food in 10 minutes. The ultimate impulse service. Could those businesses potentially squeeze through the gaps of this legislation? Because if they could, then suddenly that's a massive new channel for the impulse manufacturers to potentially exploit. But I think all we can say is over the next 6 months to a year, there's going to be a lot of changes to this legislation before it gets nailed down in black and white. That's me, Darren.
Andrew, thank you very much. If anyone's got a question, please would you put it in the chat, and we'll ask Andrew maybe before we move on. Andrew, I'm just going to ask you to expand on the rapid groceries or ultra-fast groceries as they're known. We talked about them not being covered. There was a prediction by JP Morgan that they would take a large slice of the UK grocery market, wasn't there?
Yeah, I mean, probably haven't got time to get into all the detail, but obviously on our website there's a web chat about it. But yeah, JP Morgan, obviously being an investment bank, they were looking at it from a purely financial perspective, and just looking at the sort of the net margins these rapid grocers can operate because of their super low cost operating model, and saying that as a result of that and the sheer amount of private equity money that is flowing into these startups, that they could end up with 50% of the grocery market. But yeah, I think you have to take that with a huge pinch of HFSS salt, if I can say that.
And just coming back to your point, so that potentially is 50% of the market that might not be covered. Just linking those 2 points together.
Yeah, if it ever happened, as I said, these rapid grocers are online. They market online, so they'll be covered potentially by the online part of this. Yeah. So we'll wait and see. It's just an interesting thing to watch.
And Russ, just coming to you for a moment, because you were nodding during Andrew's part around what products are covered, and I sense from you there are a lot more products covered than maybe we think.
I think so, yeah. I mean, because Nielsen tends to categorise things differently, and what we've seen, it does cover quite a broad stroke of products that you may not think were included. I can add our category definition to the deck if you like at the end, Darren. I just don't want to add it because it adds confusion, as Nielsen segmentation tends to do.
Fair enough. I think the point you're making is there's a lot more covered than actually we think. It's not just the obvious of confectionery and ice cream, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff.
Yes, definitely.
All right. Thank you, Russ. Okay, Andrew, thank you very much. We move on to Mark. Mark, there's your first slide, and we're talking about, move on to Andy. That'd be one mistake. We move on to Andy, and Andy is our category management specialist, and this is your first slide. So Andy, I'll hand over to you whilst I recover from my gaffe.
That's okay, Darren, thank you. And good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be called Mark. I've been called a heck of a lot worse by Darren. So for the next few minutes, I wanted to spend some time, and I think partly reiterating on what Russell has said, but really starting to get into the nuts and bolts of some of those restrictions that are going to be placed in terms of where we can and can't cite products, and then the ultimate impacts that's going to be there when it comes to being able to promote our products. Historically, the way we've done that may change, and I think then we can spend a little bit of time considering how we become a little bit more creative, how we think a little bit differently. I think for me, coming at it from a category management perspective and kind of often referring to that as a three-legged stool, it's got to be right for our retail channels, it's got to be right for our suppliers supplying those products, and ultimately it's got to be right for our shoppers, our consumers that are buying the products. We could look at this as a very negative, terrible thing for the industry, but ultimately the thinking behind it is sound because of what it's ultimately trying to achieve. Why we can be resistant to it and why we can be frustrated by it and all of that good stuff, the reality is we've got to embrace it for all the right reasons. It's there to do the right thing. It's how we choose to work with it as opposed to against it. So I'm going to build on some of those things that we've previously heard around those 13 categories, or how we choose to then cut them, and then the impact that that's going to bring to the options that we have to help market and all that good stuff that comes with our product management. Darren, let's jump into the next slide, please. All right, so restrictions to placements. In summary, it's about store entrances. It's then those foyers, those lobbies, the atriums that we've got, where we typically see this as prime, high footfall, high propensity to be seen areas. It's those areas that ultimately are going to be either have to be reused for other areas, which in turn gives us an opportunity, and or being very sharp at making sure we're not having those HFSS products there. And the same goes for the online environments, whether it be our landing pages, our home pages, category pages, making sure that those products are no longer seen first off. When we then get into our typical main area for volume, our end of aisles, our gondola ends, gone are the days, and very similar to that image that we see there, gone are the days of all that massive middle aisle being used to promote and drive ultimate volume. So any of that fixed or standalone secondary space is effectively gone. We are going to be limited to just what we class as our standard on-shelf space. So whether it be off-site bins, gondola ends, shippers, any HFS products are no longer going to be able to use that stuff. And again, for the online environment, whether we have pages within pages, stores within stores, shops within shops, that featured space is also going to be absolutely restricted. And I think that keyword is about restrictions. There are, of course, some flex, and we're going to come to that in a little bit. We're being absolutely clear, those key areas, front of store, end of aisle, we then move into the checkout areas, and also then the associated queuing areas. So it's anything, whether it's manned or unmanned in terms of those checkouts, that space can no longer be used for promotion and citing of those products. Now, interestingly, maybe one of those slightly grey areas, when we're talking about those associated queuing areas, if that associated queuing areas happens to just move into a main aisle, then actually it's okay. I think there's some of these grey areas that I think are going to need to be clarified, otherwise we end up moving all our tills into our main aisles and we're suddenly, we're okay, but we're going to be very mindful. Likewise for the online environment, those equivalent payment pages, again, where we may typically see that, have you considered, did you forget, and all of that clever marketing that takes place just before you make your final purchase is all, again, absolutely restricted. So for me, in summary there, restrictions to placement, it's about store entrance, end of aisle, our gondola ends, and then our checkout areas and associated queuing areas. We've got to be really slick about how we view those areas, and actually we're just now limited to what we would class as as main aisle. Now, interestingly, there's those special aisles, what we might class as seasonal space. They're okay. We're okay to still use that space, providing we are not using volume promotions and providing they, the promotional criteria kicks into it, and providing they then fall into that sort of checkout queuing area. But that special aisle, those seasonal aisles, that space is actually okay, providing it's classed as the primary source of spacing. All right, so restrictions on placement. Let's move into promotions then, Darren, please, on next slide. Okay, so for me, the biggest challenge now is to then understand how we can market, advertise and support those products that we want to ultimately get awareness to. And part of kind of the role within category management is to bring to life our products through awareness. And I think historically for me, promotions are often used as a blunt tool to drive volume. Actually, we've now got to get far slicker at that. So some of those levers and pulleys we were able to pull before in terms of the multi-buy and extra free, that transaction and rewarding loyalty now mechanics are now absolutely restricted. And this, of course, is both relevant in terms of our bricks and our clicks environment. And I'll just give a quick nod to it. There's some talk around existing packaging being able to use up all the way through to April 2023. Again, I think that's going to need some clarification. Otherwise, we could end up manufacturing a heck of a lot of packaging and just say we're using it up, but hey, let's be mindful of that. One positive, however, though, price point labeling on packs, as far as we understand at the moment, is okay to be used. That isn't part of the regulations. So price point advertising, when we're drawing the attention to maybe value, we're running EDLP, then that's okay. I think we've got to be quite careful how we then use that in terms of what we would class as a high-low strategy, but it's one to be very mindful of. Another area that's maybe not covered, we're talking about multi-buys are covered, but meal deals are actually exempt. So if you're going in to buy your sandwich, your drink and your crisps, they aren't covered, albeit they will be by location restrictions. So again, we've got to be kind of clever and mindful of how this stuff happens. And coming back to those other areas, those 13 categories, size of store, 2,000 square foot or less, and 50 employees or less. Okay, Darren, last slide for me, please.
Okay, cool, thank you.
I think one of the other parts to me is, it's yes, we can get very hung up on what we can't do, but maybe we now need to start considering what we can do. And again, some of this we heard from Russ earlier. We understand the practical limitations. What I want to do is then provide some thought, provocation that we either take back to our businesses or we push back to our suppliers, or suppliers start having that conversation. What can we do to look at our products in terms of the high salt or high sugar content that they've got, high fat content they've got? Is there some reformulation work? And does actually this ultimately give suppliers the opportunity to look with a critical eye at what they're supplying and try and embrace this as a change? What will ultimately come is actually we're freeing up some money here. We've got some reallocation of marketing spend that we can reuse. And for me, that goes hand in hand with that money that we invest in our point of sale and all of that stuff that sits with that marketing. We've now got a great opportunity to raise awareness of maybe our products that are a little bit more, for want of a better word, fit for purpose, to bring light and shine a light on those guys there. So we'll be mindful of how we can do our product awareness stuff. When we're then getting down to it, there is going to be some battlegrounds. It's going to be around that premium space. If we are only managing volume off our standard primary space, where do our primary brands, secondary brands, own brands, how do we flex that space to ensure we're maintaining availability so we can still deliver on customer requirements of actually having choice? That space has got to work harder. There's got to be a level of elasticity to it to ensure that we're maintaining on-shelf availability. Now, whether we get even slicker at things like SRP, or we consider how we're then flexing that space or managing that space because we've lost what was our volume driving area, then they're good challenges to have. And ultimately, through good levels of analysis and understanding of requirements, we can start to make some really informed decisions on what that looks like. In terms of seasonal products, whether it's Christmas, Diwali, Easter, and any of that good stuff, yeah, we've still got space for that. It's via our seasonal aisle, via those special aisles. Now, providing, as I said, they're not sited near the checkouts, in queuing areas, and all that good stuff. We can still utilize that space, and we can still utilize price promotions. As far as we understand it right now, we can still utilize price promotions in that main aisle. What we don't then get to have is then secondary space, massive, great big displays elsewhere. So maybe we do need to be mindful of how we're using that area, advertising it, communicating it, and all of that good stuff there. Okay, bunch of whole thoughts there. Do we know all the answers? No, of course we don't. But I think there is a conversation to be had on how we can start exploring and getting under the skin of this to see, well, what are our options for the future? Time is on our side, but the reality is that's going to go very, very quickly. We need to start thinking about this stuff now and starting those conversations pretty darn soon. Darren, I think we may have had a question come up during that. So do we want to go to that?
We did. I was going to give you a breather. Let me ask the other guys, and we'll come back to you on this question. So for our panel, Russ, Mark, and Andrew, we've got a question. Are temporary fixtures like freestanding display units that are situated around the store in scope, provided these are not at the end of aisles, at store entrances or checkouts? So quite a complex question. I can read it again. Let me just see if I can get any first thoughts from you.
Yeah, my interpretation of that would be, I say probably 9 times out of 10, a freestanding unit is also located on the main fixture anyway. So I would class that as a secondary siting. So it would fall foul of the new legislation.
Good. All right, Russ, anyone else? You getting lots of nods from the rest. Any other opinions?
Russell's absolutely right. It's that secondary space, whether that be shippers, bins, anything that's used to, let's use the word promote and expand a secondary space. I agree. I believe as it stands, that is covered and will no longer be allowed.
Okay, brilliant. All right, thank you, panel. We've got one more question. I'm going to come to that because we've got time. On-shelf promotions are permitted in store. What would the online equivalent be? Let's see, Andy, I'm going to come to you to see if you can answer that. I'll read it again. On-shelf promotions are permitted in store. What would the online equivalent be?
I think the rule set's still exactly the same. When we're talking about volume promotions, we're talking about multi-buys and extra free, in which case they are now restricted, whether that's online or in a physical store environment. We can price point label products, but my understanding, and I'm happy to throw it back to the other guys for their understanding as well, is that any volume promotions either online or in-store are restricted.
Russ, would you add to that, please?
Yeah, I think the equivalent would be when you get to the aisle page. So if you click on confectionery, for example, and you get the product list page, they'd be able to put a price discount on there. But you wouldn't be able to be looking at, I don't know, fresh chicken and then have a little pop-up going, hey, don't forget to buy your dairy milk.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point there, Russ makes. So we're talking about those meal deals or those dine for 2, dine for 4 type deals. They can still be used. So the meal deals, lunchtime meal deals, dine for 2 meal deals can be used. And again, it's still going to be restricted in terms of its location. There's just that little grey area of actually, can I go buy a chicken, buy a bag of potatoes, buy a chocolate bar? I think that's going to fall foul, of course.
I think, Russ, you've started a new recipe, chocolate chicken. I'm up for it.
I'm going to give it a go tonight.
Right. And let's come to one more. This is a great link into Mark's piece, because someone's asking about great presentations. Have we seen similar legislation come into force in other countries? I'm going to hold that and come over to Mark, because Mark's going to talk about that. So, Mark, please, would you share your thoughts? And I'll put your first slide on screen.
Firstly, thank you again for attending, everybody, and I'm really pleased to be presenting at this webinar, which Wanzl have brought to you with the support of MBM. As you've seen, my contribution is about the knowledge and support available to retailers within the supply chain. And what I'd really like to discuss with you guys today is the impact of real-life examples of a similar scale legislation on retailers all around the world, and how those affected retailers collaborated with their supply chains to adapt their businesses whilst generating opportunities delivering for their customers. So Rob's question will be answered very shortly. First of all, a bit of background about Wanzl. We are a global retail solutions provider with a direct presence in 27 countries, including the UK and Ireland. The majority of our business is generated within food retail environments. So as you'd expect, working with some of the largest grocers, everything in our business from day-to-day operations to product development is driven by the constantly changing shopping patterns within their businesses, and anything that affects that, such as new legislations, new routes to fulfillment like click and collect and home delivery, new technologies like frictionless checkouts. Our job is to help navigate these changes and use them to maximise their business trading potential. So today I wanted just to share some of that experience in the hope that it might inspire some creative thinking when responding to high-fat sugar and salts legislation and turn this into an opportunity for your business. Darren, next slide, please. Let's start with Ireland. As some of you will know, last year legislation was introduced to combat what the Irish government considered to be the country's unhealthy relationship with alcohol consumption, particularly among young people. The legislation was targeted to reduce young people's exposure to the influences of in-store promotions and delay their early exposure to the alcohol and minimise the risk of later alcohol-related abuse and harm. The law in Ireland now requires that all beers, wines and spirits areas within product stores, especially supermarkets, is completely segregated from the rest of the store environment. It is an entirely separate area now with a physical separating barrier of at least 1.2 metres in height, which obscures and hides the visibility of any alcohol, adverts or promotions. So the challenge here is how do you ensure that you comply with the legislation without disrupting that customer journey? The positive from this was it gave retailers an opportunity to enhance the identity of the BWS area and be creative with the design to deliver a better customer experience. Only time will tell whether this works or not, but at the very least, it encouraged retailers to think creatively when implementing responses to product restrictions in store and working closely with suppliers to develop the solution. Next slide, please. Moving on to Scandinavia, similar restriction measures have been introduced on the merchandising and sale of tobacco products. This won't come as a surprise to us in the UK, as retailers of this legislation has been in place for some time now. But it is an interesting point to mention as the approach has been slightly different. As used to be the case in Germany, Scandinavian retailers used to merchandise the tobacco products alongside queue lines and over checkout belts, a bit like we merchandise impulse purchases such as confectionery and chewing gum for now. However, legislation was introduced to reduce the likeliness of this merchandising method, encouraging young people to take up smoking. Just like here in the UK, it involves removing the tobacco products from site, relocating them into enclosed cabinets, drawers, or tobacco dispensing units at the point of sale. The opportunity that retailers quickly realised was to merchandise alternative products within this same space. And it became a premium marketing space for other brands that would never normally had that space available to them. The same as where over-the-counter medicines were concerned, the Scandinavian government also implemented protective legislation to ensure that potential harmful medicines do not become easily accessible to children in store. This means that retailers were required to merchandise these products behind locked cabinets, making them available to customers upon request. By default, this has reduced the likeliness of theft, such as showcasing factors where retailers use cabinet fixtures to showcase them on non-prescription medicines. So this really gave two benefits and reduced their shrinkage quite exponentially. Next slide, please. So moving to France and Belgium, the HFSS discussion has already started there. However, they are taking an initial educational approach to the legislation. Any food and drink considered to contain higher than advised levels of sugar, salts or fats are now required to display what's called a Nutri-Score scale on the packaging, similar to our wheel, which we feature on most of our product packaging here in the UK. This is an example of where retailers have had to adapt with brands, not just on store product packaging, but to help consumers make healthier shopping choices. But the same as the legislation coming into the UK next year, this also applies to online purchases. Retailers such as Carrefour and Auchan have had to place the Nutri-Score information on their website close to the add to basket button so that people can make them choices when they select them goods. Interestingly, French and Belgian retailers have used the Nutri-Score protocol to advertise fresh and healthier products in store to inspire customers to buy fresh and frozen non-processed products. So giving another opportunity for other areas to excel. Next slide, please. Heading down under now, and if you thought Ireland's alcohol legislation was all-encompassing, I think the Australians have taken it a step further. Putting this into perspective, as you can see on the slide, the different levels of requirements from state to state is very unhelpful for a national retailer like Woolworths or Coles, who are required to comply with localised legislation whilst trying to create a consistent shopping experience in all of their stores across the country. As always, though, creative thinking has developed an opportunity for retailers like Coles, who have now created a successful standalone business out of their BWS offering by trading these operations under the Liquorland brand name, both in a store within a store basis, but also as a standalone offering. Importantly, these requirements have given Australian retailers the opportunity to experiment with multiple different formats in the BWS area, both in and out of stores across different state requirements. Next slide, please. So, to conclude, the introduction of the new legislation in retail has often been seen as a restriction of practices which were previously considered to be acceptable, but in reality, that isn't the case. With every change, whether it's through natural evolution of shopping behaviours or enforced legislation change, opportunity always follows, and in our experience, the ones who succeed are the ones who capitalise on the knowledge and experience of their supply chains. Those who adopt a creative approach to alternative options and those who collaborate with partners and industry peers to enhance their customer shopping experience will see the best results, I'm confident. This brings me right back to where I started. We and the rest of your supply chain are your partners, and the purpose is to help you realise your maximum trading potential. We all have an interest in ensuring that your business can successfully navigate these changes in the retail landscape, so please ask us. I'd like to now thank everybody who's taken the time to attend this webinar. I look forward to further discussions with you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. Mark, before I come back to you for a takeaway, I'm just going to pick up on a question here. And Andrew, I'm going to come to you. Just for an opinion, you may not have one. Do the restrictions still apply for gifting? For example, gift set including confectionery and a non-food item. Do you have an opinion?
Gosh, that's a good one.
It's a good one, isn't it? I was reading that thinking, yeah, that's good.
I imagine it's covered. If it contains an HFSS product, then it's all the other caveats, more than 2,000 square foot, 50 employees, except pre-packaged, then my initial reaction would be yeah.
Okay, let me just come to Russ, see if you've got an opinion, then I'll ask Andy, then we'll come back to Mark. Russ, an opinion on this?
Yeah, no, I agree with Andrew. I think if it's, on gift sets, you still got to have the nutritional information on the back of it, even if there's a non-food gift within there. So my opinion would be it still fall under HFSS.
Okay, all right, let's just check in with Andy. I guess the same, Andy, similar? Yeah, okay. You're on mute, just in case. Okay, I think we're getting a thumbs up. All right.
Disagreeing. No, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think what the guys have said is spot on. Okay. All right. So I like the question particularly. We're trying to find a way through this and trying to find some common ground, but it sounds like it's covered. Let me just pick up on another question, and then I'll come back to Mark. Hearing your experience, what would you say are the challenges you have found when adapting stores to the legislation such as BWS? What would you say are the challenges you have found when adapting stores to the legislation such as BWS? Oh, I'm not sure we're going to know the answers to that, but I thought I'd put it to the panel.
I think the first one is, and I think it's the one that I'm hearing from everybody on the panel, is the clarity around the legislation. That's always going to be the first one. Certainly with the legislation in Ireland, the approval went quite quickly, but it took a long time before the actual nuts and bolts of that legislation was made clear to retailers, and even then there was a lot of grey areas. So and sometimes people try to look for the grey areas before they actually try to implement. So trying to adapt stores initially is making sure that you know what to adapt for and then go from there.
All right, cool. Mark, just coming back to your presentation, thank you, very insightful. What's your one takeaway you'd like these attendees to take home with them?
I think the biggest one is, yes, we do have time, but it will soon get eaten up quite quickly. So I think Andy said we need to start the process now, and whatever was planned for the time that this is now going to be implemented is going to need to either be brought forward or changed or actually repurposed, and the projects that are being completed now. So the earlier the discussions is going to be really key in making sure that this is as seamless as possible of an introduction.
Okay. All right, thank you, Mark. We've got some more questions. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you all. Very insightful. We're going to move into our question and answers piece. So here. We've got questions. We've got other people in the panel. So I'll ask you guys, but we might ask some of the other people that are listening who are part of our panel. Let me read out our next question. Given this is a change that will affect all retailers, given the likely volume of new equipment that could be required, how are Wanzl getting themselves prepared for likely demand? Oh, it's a Wanzl question. It's got to be you, Mark.
No, very good question. With our scope and our production capabilities, we have a number of manufacturing facilities globally, so we're able to call upon them. Usually we work with our European first for speed of response. So being able to pull upon them resources gives us a unique offering. So that will be is what we're doing to make sure that we're in a good position for the volume requirements. The challenge will always also be with that is making sure that retailers do also try and have a common ground. So we'll also try to be implementing common solutions with embellishment that suits each retailer.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you very much. Okay. We've got another question. Just before I answer that, if anyone's got any questions, please put them in the chat. We're in our Q&A session. Let's see if we can put our panel on the spot a bit. It is only their opinions because we're still waiting for the legislation to come through, but their opinions are very valid. They've got a huge amount of experience. Do any of our panel, question from me, thinking about what you said, Mark, around the Ireland and the legislation, do we know how much alcohol dropped when that legislation came in? I guess we don't, but I thought I'd ask.
It only came in November, and a bit like this legislation, there'll be a time period. So you have to be seen to have a schedule and a strategy behind it, and started the implementation phase in November, but that will run for a further 6 to 12 months. So actually the drop might be quite small in the early stages, so none of them results have been shared as yet.
Understood. Okay, let me just check in with Russ and make sure you haven't heard anything about what the potential drop in sales is.
Yeah, I mean, the problem we've got is that the on-trade has been closed in Ireland a lot longer than it has in the actual UK, so it's quite difficult to tell how, to strip out that factor to see how much it has impacted.
Okay.
But it's certainly something we can monitor going forward.
But it is a good point. It is a good point, though, when we're talking about delays and things like that. Even with the pandemic, the Irish government didn't delay the introduction of this. So whilst we're hopeful that things could get delayed to give us more time, we shouldn't be reliant on that.
All right, let me come to our next question. Is there anything in the legislation preventing retailers from separating as store-in-store offerings for the 13 categories covered by HFSS, similar to Coles Liquorland option in Australia?
I think it's a nice, absolutely. So yes, you could do a store in a store and it could be less than 2,000 square foot, in which case maybe you're then not restricted. Unfortunately, that's then a trade-off because you've got to then have less than 50 employees. So when you're then part of a wider operation, a wider company, I think you get called on it.
So Andy, if I'm a big retailer and I want to set up a separate company and we call that a concession, it's a separate limited PLC company, is that's still doable? I can do this concession?
I think the reality is you're going to have more than 50 employees. It's not just about the 50 employees in the store, it's going to be 50 employees. So if you're part of, then you're going to be restricted because you're going to ultimately have more than 50 employees connected to that concession.
All right, let me just check in with the rest of the panel. Andrew?
I was going to say, if you think back 15, 20 years ago, stores used to have a health food section. Are we going to have an unhealth food section?
The unhealthy store, yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm already writing my business plan for a 1,999 square foot store with 49 employees selling unhealthy food at half price.
Brilliant, thank you, Andrew. All right, coming to our attendees, thank you once again. What other questions do you have for our panel? I'll just give you a few seconds if you wouldn't mind typing. I think we've covered the other questions that you posed. If we haven't, and you think we haven't, please copy and paste it again, just so I know that you would like another opinion. Okay, we've got another one come in. How will we ensure, panel, that retailers are following the rules? Will there be store spot checks? I'm going to come to Andrew first of all as our legislative opinion. What do you think?
Yeah, it was on one of my slides. It will be local authority enforcement. So just as they have, health and safety inspectors, food standard inspectors, I will probably go to the food standard inspectors, I imagine. So yeah, they'll wander around the store, and just as they did with, COVID and PPE and queuing systems, they can wander into a store and see if it's compliant. So it will be pretty well policed.
And do you think it will be a finable thing, Andrew? Will it fall under legislation? I'm trying to wrap my head around, obviously not GSCOP or competition law, but I don't know.
Well, it'll be in the legislation. There will be provision for non-compliance, and I imagine it will be, again, with food standards. It's a fine. I imagine it won't end up with the store being closed down, but I'm sure there'll be a fine structure.
A wrap on the knuckles. Let me just come to the rest of our panel if you have a slightly different opinion or a different build on that. No? Okay. All right, I think we've covered that one. Thank you. Any other final questions? We've got a few minutes to go, but I'm not going to hold you if we don't have any. Any other final questions coming through? All right, just while we wait for those to come in, I'm just going to come to each of the four on our panel for one thing that you haven't said before that you'd like these guys to take away. All right, so I'll give you a moment to think about that. And that will be our wrap up. What I'll also do is a shameless punt to our next webinar, which is either ultra fast groceries, which we're going to be talking about. The panel have mentioned those before. And also the other one we're going to be doing is stores of the future. So we've got two webinars coming up. They'll probably be in September. Let's come back to here. Entrance area. Do you think this will be the area directly opposite the entrance or first aisle? So the entrance area directly opposite the entrance or first aisle.
Yeah, so I think it's the atrium, foyer, that main initial area that you walk in when you're coming through the store entrance. That's all covered, as in you are restricted from citing and promoting or promoting HFSS products in those areas.
All right. Any other builds from our panel?
I think they'll probably suggest that it's within a certain square footage from the entrance door area to ensure that people don't try and move that what's considered the entrance area.
That makes sense. All right, we've got another one. Question for Paul Rowlands. Paul is the operations director for Home Bargains. Paul, how do you see legislation changing your business? I know Paul's on audio, so let's just see if we can get him back here.
Thanks for the question. I guess it's different for every retailer to one degree or another when you get to the final stages of legislation. So to the question just posed, if foyer is our draft lobby, then our biggest impact on star buys isn't really in the game. But I think it'll be the final levels of detail that we'll get to that level. However, what I would say is that for all operators, fundamentally, having been through a pandemic, a pingdemic, and a class 1 driver shortage, the operators of this country can innovate and find a solution. Essentially, what will happen here is that we are impacting space to sales, and that has two implications. One, a cost impact of lowering our one-way stock, because these are all volume items generating significant turnover. And then equally, from an availability point of view, managing the same volume in less space always gives difficulties. And I guess, whilst on a lower scale, we definitely have in Northern Ireland and Scotland defined areas for alcohol that we have to manage. So there's some learnings from all of that, but from my perspective, I think the finer detail is where we'll get to the real big impacts, and not all retailers will be impacted equally. I think there'll be some big losers in this.
Okay, Paul, brilliant, thank you. Someone I think is trying to pick on you in the nicest possible way. They said, and what responsibility do retailers have on encouraging healthier eating? So I'll just read that again, Paul. And what responsibility do you think retailers have on encouraging healthier eating?
I think it's a really difficult question. Perhaps asking Marcus Radforth would be probably a more defined answer as to how we deal with the issue. But from my perspective, it depends what retailer you are, and it depends what spend you have in influencing the consumer, both in store, at home, and online. And so if you look to the big four grocers in the NPD in own label, then you'd suggest there's significant opportunity to influence the consumer. If you're in the discount element of the market, you don't spend a huge amount of money influencing the consumer at home, then it's somewhat more difficult to do so. And I guess asking somebody not to participate in markets where they have a customer base that has a demand for a product, I don't see many retailers unilaterally deciding to opt out of some of these markets.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you, Paul. I'm just going to put our next question. Russ, I'd like to start with you, if you wouldn't mind. The question is FTG, food to go, hot food, Costa, Tango, Ice Blast. Are these exempt as they are for immediate consumption? I don't know if you have an opinion on that. I realise it's opinion-based at the moment rather than fact.
Oh, that's a good question, and I don't really have a good answer to. I mean, all the categories that I've seen is all packaged and to take home, so potentially they could be excluded.
That sounds as if it's out of home consumption, in which case it's not covered. I think there is one caveat to that, and it's those free refills. You get your paper cup, you go up to the machine, you put some ice in it, and then you fill it up with whatever sugary drink you want. I think that those free refills are now covered, are exempt or restricted, should I say.
Okay. All right, we think we've answered that. We've got a couple of opinions there. Thank you very much, Chris. I'm aware we're coming to the end. I'd just like to say a big thank you, Paul and our speakers. They've put a lot of time into bringing their opinions. Remember, it's really tough at the moment because the legislation hasn't been clarified. If you'd like to collaborate, create a think tank, join the next webinar, any of those, or if we've just prompted food for thought, no pun intended. Thank you all very much for attending, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, everyone. If we can just hang for a couple of minutes, we'll just let everyone go.